Good evening, everyone. Thank you, of course, for joining us this evening. Tonight, it will be an absolutely interesting panel, and I'm pleased to be your moderator this evening. My name is Richard Rambarran. I am a lecturer in the Department of Economics at the University of Guyana. That is the portfolio under which I will be hosting this program this evening. I'm certainly pleased once again to be able to bring to you a distinguished panel and introduce a number of gentlemen here who are very noteworthy in their field, and I certainly look forward to the contributions that they'll bring this evening. Just by way of introduction, I'll introduce the topic as well as the guests that we have here this evening on the program. And I would certainly like to thank all our viewers and listeners who consistently tune in to this program to ensure that we have to support us essentially in these riveting discussions. I'll start by, of course, introducing Mr. Kevin Ramnarine, who is to the right of me in this screen. Mr. Kevin Ramnarine is a former energy minister in Trinidad and Tobago. He currently sits on the Local Content Advisory Committee, which has been put together by His Excellency Dr. Fanali. And Kevin has been involved in a number of discussions in and around the private sector and oil and gas development in Guyana and also in the wider Caribbean. We also have to the bottom of Mr. Ramnarine, Mr. Timothy Jonas, who of course has become no stranger to this program. He is perhaps the most consistent guest here on Globespan. Mr. Jonas speaks tonight in his capacity as chairman of a new and united Guyana, and he has been very familiar with the oil and gas sector. He has been at the forefront of fighting many of our battles which we have faced over the past few months, and we certainly look forward to his insights. With us this evening, we have Mr. Tom Mitro, who is a senior fellow at the Columbia Center for Sustainable Investment at Columbia University in New York from the United States of America. So we have Mr. Mitro, I believe, joining us for the very first time, if I'm not mistaken. Mr. Mitro, am I correct?
Once before, about a year ago, we had a discussion, so
right.
Second time.
Okay, so for the second time, but certainly this is the first time that I am meeting him and the first time that we are interacting in this forum. So of course, the topic this evening is opportunities for Guyanese in the oil and gas industry. But of course, as is normal when we host these discussions, as all of the gentlemen who are on this panel know, these discussions tend to encapsulate, given their nature, a much broader ambit within which the discourse will operate. So we'll be touching, of course, on opportunities for Guyanese in the oil and gas industry this evening, and that will be our principal thrust of the program. But we will also discuss a number of issues which are tangential, but of course interrelated with the oil and gas sector. Of course, including many of the issues that go along with the burgeoning oil and gas sector and the development of the country. So we'll want to kick this evening's discussion off very soon. But gentlemen, I just wish to thank you very much for joining us. I am very sure that all Guyanese certainly look forward to your insights, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to share this with you. So thank you. I'll just start this evening by us discussing firstly how the oil and gas sector is positioned in Guyana currently, and what are your general expectations for Guyana from the development of this sector. And I'll actually start this discussion off by asking Timothy firstly to give his insight, then we'll move to Kevin, and then we'll move to Tom. So the reason why I'm moving like this is, of course, because Timothy has intense local knowledge. Kevin, of course, will operate operating at the regional level, will have good insight into what's happening in the Caribbean, of course, being a former energy minister of Trinidad, and of course, traveling around the Caribbean. And then, of course, Tom will have a very internationalized perspective, given his portfolio. So I'd want to start this discussion off this evening with that, and I'll posit it to Timothy to begin. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Richard. First of all, any forewarning, and I am mightily impressed with the panel that you've put together. I rather suspect this is going to be a learning curve for me and for your listeners, so I am really looking forward to it. I also like the balance that you talk about. My very small local knowledge, but against that, a wealth of experience in terms of a past Minister of Energy from Trinidad, a country that has gone through what we will be going through, albeit probably on a smaller scale, but has with that experience and that background. And then, of course, Tom, who has direct experience in oil and gas. I was lucky enough to have a chance to speak to him before the program started, and I'm sure he will introduce himself and impress us with his credentials, but I'm already impressed. So I look forward to this discussion. I think with oil and gas in Guyana, as in any new industry in a third world country that has the potential to revolutionize everything and change everything politically, socially, culturally, we have to consider the ramifications in that light, politically, socially, and then in terms of how we will evolve as a society, given the fact that we will have large immigration and where this newfound windfall needs to be applied to make everybody's life better. In the context of Guyana as we are, I hope that this discussion in terms of the politics looks at the experiences that have been had in other countries in light of the need for transparency in dealing with oil and gas, in dealing with the wealth, and in dealing with the commercial transactions with the various companies in the oil and gas industry. It can be done behind closed doors, and I know that experiences internationally, from the good system that exists in Sweden to the bad system that exists in Nigeria, we have examples that we may want to follow and examples that we may want to issue. And there is no doubt that we need to identify up front where we need to be in terms of transparency and in terms of the governance models and control of the industry in the hands of the politicians. That boils down to the society. We need to make sure that we are embracing the folk who come in the oil and gas industry, the experts that are coming in. We talk about the potential locally, and I think we do that without considering the reality that we don't have any expertise in Guyana. Companies have been coming in. I've been speaking to investors. They are all satellites to Exxon, to the oil and gas. They all offer services to the giant. And any of those services, if you want to pick one, in terms of the nature of the operations, the stuff that they pull out in the drilling process, how they dispose of it, how they separate it out chemically to reduce it to something that is not dangerous to the environment. We don't know anything about that. So in every single aspect of what is done in the wrench turning, in the nuts and bolts aspect of the operation, we don't know, we got to learn. In terms of the economics, we don't know, we got to learn. In terms of the regulatory side, seeing how the internal finances of Exxon works, regulating them and seeing how much money they make and what their expenses are, we don't know, we got to learn. So I think that we have to acknowledge, first of all, that we are at the start of a learning curve. And I think the panel you got here hopefully can take us down that road.
Thank you for that, Timothy, and thank you, of course, for segueing into something which is, of course, of utmost importance as we proceed this evening. Because what I would like for us to bring out here is along the line of comparative analysis. Because historically, we can look at many of the countries and we can see countries which have been perhaps at similar stages of development, which may have had similar political environments or polities of Guyana. We also can look at those that have been integrated into the global architecture at the same time as we have, and perhaps learn from those countries. They not necessarily have to be oil and gas producers, but resource-rich economies. I think that we do have quite a lot to learn from. One such resource-rich economy, of course, is that of Trinidad and Tobago, and they have quite a mature oil and gas sector. Mr. Ramnarine has been involved, of course, with the energy chamber from the private sector side, and he has also been involved from the government side. So, Kevin, what do you see and what do you expect for Guyana? And let me ask it particularly within a time frame. What do you see for Guyana within the short term, being, let's say, about a year, 12 months to 24 months? What do you see for Guyana in the medium term, in about 5 years? And then what do you see for Guyana as we move into the long term?
Well, Guyana is very different from Trinidad in terms of the industry. So Guyana's first taste of oil and gas, the oil and gas industry, is in the deep water. Trinidad is now exploring its deep water. So Trinidad's industry started off on land in the early 20th century. And then we went on into the shallow water, then the average depth water, and then finally we're now in the deep water. So as we speak, there's an important well being drilled in our deep water called Broadside. And the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago had an entire press conference about 3 weeks ago just to talk about the Broadside well. So Guyana has started off where we are at this point in time. And that gives Guyana a completely different experience. And I'll give you a little perspective. Today I was in Port of Spain having a meeting and we were talking about this difference between Trinidad and Guyana. If the oil and gas industry picks up in Trinidad in the next 2 years, it's immediately felt in South and Central Trinidad because we have these downstream industries at Point Lisas. So they will suddenly spring to life because they get more natural gas. In Guyana, the industry is out of sight of the average man. So the industry is 130 miles out into the sea. The average Guyanese may never see a FPSO. They may see pictures of it. They will never see a drill ship. They may see pictures of it. So that's one of the main differences between the two countries. So where's Guyana now? So you've had first oil in record time. And I mean, first oil in 5 years is an incredible achievement. And you started to produce oil, and there is a ramp up that's going to take place. And the way I see it is that Guyana has at least 10 years of exploration ahead of it in terms of continuous exploration drilling. So that there's something in the industry called the creaming curve. And if you go back to the very first talk I gave in Guyana in January 2017, at the Pegasus, I talked about this, is a very simple curve. It has on the y-axis, it has cumulative reserves discovered, and on the x-axis, it has the number of exploration wells drilled. And what you find is that the early part of that curve is very steep, and then it eventually flattens. So Guyana, I think, is a long way away from that curve flattening. So you still have a lot more acreage to explore, and there are blocks which haven't even been explored. You're now exploring the Kaitio and the Kanji block, and there are other. If you look at the Starbrook block, Richard, and you look at where Exxon has been drilling in the Starbrook block, they've been drilling mainly in the southern part of the Starbrook block, and I think that might have something to do with the fact that there's a border dispute. The border dispute is more to the north of the Starbrook block, right? So they want to stay as far as possible away from any sort of controversy with that northern part of Starbuck block. So the point is, I think the 2020s is going to be this period of incredible growth in the Guyanese economy. And then after that, the industry should begin to mature in Guyana in the 2030s. And you may go into what they call the operations and maintenance phase and so on. But you should reach your peak oil production by the end of this decade, according to most Wood Mackenzie's and Rystads and so on. You should reach your peak oil production of somewhere between 1 to 1.2 million barrels of oil per day, which would make Guyana the second largest producer of oil in the South and Central America. If Venezuelan oil production stays where it is, well below 1 million barrels of oil per day. So Guyana becomes the second largest producer of oil in the South and Central American part of the Americas, second only to Brazil. And that fundamentally changes the country. So the opportunities for Guyanese to get a foothold in this sector is really in the next 10 years and more so in the next 5 years. So to use the metaphor, the iron is hot at this point in time, and the people who get in now would have that first mover advantage, and they would surmount the learning curve before people who come in later. So that's how I see the next 10 years panning out. After that, you go from this exploration phase. I mean, there will always be exploration, because there's exploration in Trinidad today, and there was exploration in Trinidad 110 years ago. But the real steep part of the exploration curve is in the next 10 years. The 8 billion barrels of, and I'll make one final point about natural gas, because natural gas is something which is very near and dear to me. It's you could say it's my bread and butter, right? Exxon made a statement a few weeks ago, Mr. Alistair Routledge. He made a statement which I don't know if it's the first time his statement was made, Richard, or if it was made before and I didn't hear it. But he said of the 8 billion barrels of oil equivalent, 20% of that is natural gas. So 20% of 8 billion barrels of oil equivalent is 1.6 billion barrels of oil equivalent. And converting that into natural gas, you get 9.6 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. So that's not an insignificant, that's a significant amount of natural gas. The question is, I don't think Exxon's core purpose for being in Guyana is natural gas. I think natural gas just happens to be a byproduct of why they're really here. They are in Guyana to produce oil. So there are a couple of things they could do with that natural gas. One is to re-inject some of it into the reservoir, because a reservoir has to be, a reservoir over time loses pressure, and you need to maintain reservoir pressure. So they could blow back some of that gas into the reservoir to maintain reservoir pressure, which keeps the oil flowing. Two, they could commercialize some of that gas. And three, there's a third option which we don't like, which nobody likes to hear about anywhere in the world again, which is to flare the gas. And from time to time, because of mechanical problems that they may have on the FPSOs, they may have to flare the gas for safety reasons. But flaring is something which is not liked again in the world. In fact, I am told, and I'm subject to correction because I heard this from a friend who is an expert on Venezuela, that Venezuela flares 3 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day from their oil production. Trinidad produces about 3.4 billion cubic feet of natural gas per day. There's a lot of flaring going on next door in Venezuela. Nigeria used to be one of the great flarers of natural gas, so I don't know if that still applies. But I think there is a big future for using the natural gas from these developments, the Liza 1, the Liza 2, the Payaras, and beyond, to bring that gas to shore to do many things could be done with that natural gas. And natural gas is a lot more cleaner than oil. It certainly is a lot more cleaner than coal. And the government of Dr. Irfan Ali, they have expressed the opinion that they want to go from natural gas to electricity. Because I mean, I've been in Guyana quite a lot, and if you do a little back of the envelope survey with Guyanese businessmen and you ask them what are the biggest obstacles to doing business in Guyana, electricity might come out in your top 2 or your top 3, right? So the other thing too is that electricity in Trinidad is about 4 to 6 US cents per kilowatt hour. It is the cheapest in the Caribbean and Latin America outside of Venezuela, and they have great problems with their electricity grid in that country. In Guyana, subject to correction again, but you all live in Guyana, I don't. Guyana is about what, 25 to 26 cents per US cents per kilowatt hour, Richard? Somewhere in that region for residential. So it's a lot more.
It's just about that. But of course, importantly for commercial, it's around 27 cents per kilowatt. Residential, it's a bit lower.
When I shouldn't say should, when Guyana, when the administration, when Dr. Ali's administration gets that natural gas power project implemented, you may, and I did a quick back of the envelope calculation, you're looking at about a 55% reduction in electricity prices in Guyana, in addition to which you'll have a more reliable supply. And the third and the most important thing is that you'll be able to phase out a lot of your fuel oil generators and your diesel generators and so on. So, and then there are other things that you could do with natural gas. And we could talk about that, going to urea, which is fertilizer, right? So I think you're on this curve right now, on this steep part of this creaming curve I talked about. And there are many opportunities, and I would end this first part by saying that critical to all that we just spoke about is building the institutions to manage that. There is going to be a petroleum commission. That bill, you remember that bill was floated around in the year 2017, and I had actually come to Guyana as a guest of GCCI back then, and I went around the country talking about this petroleum commission bill. And one of the things that struck me, Tim Jonas, is the bill gave the minister complete power. The minister was almost like the divine right of kings. If you go back into history, the minister had tremendous power. And both myself and Ralph Rambarran, and at that time Deodat Indar was president of the GCCI. This is something that we flagged because it was simply very obvious that the bill had put too much power in the hands of the line minister. So I'm told that bill is to come back, and that bill is to be passed in the parliament. And I think the plan is to take some of the existing institutions like the Department of Energy and the Guyana Geology and Mines and so on, and roll them up into the new Petroleum Commission. So that Petroleum Commission becomes, very important, almost as important as your Guyana Revenue Authority, because that oversees the day-to-day operations of this industry. I'll end there for now.
Absolutely, thanks for that, Kevin. You've identified, of course, from analogy that electricity is a severe constraint, and for those who are interested, of course, in looking at any document regarding this, if one does a search for constraints affecting Guyana's private sector, you'll see a paper done by the IDB, and you'll see that electricity has actually been ranked as the most severe obstacle when considering factors constraining businesses. So it is the most severe obstacle in Guyana to businesses and business growth and private sector development. The point of electricity, of course, I believe is one which is not lost on anyone, not just the reliability of electricity, but also the quality of electricity which we have here in Guyana, and the quantum of electricity or the volume of electricity given the peak load and the peak demand, is one where we certainly have to improve. And for those, of course, listeners and viewers, the ideal position where a country like Guyana would want to be is to have what we term as a sustainable energy mix, one where we have not only fossil fuels as we currently have being burned, that those would be generators and so on, but we'd also want some amount of wind power, some amount of solar power, some amount of natural gas, perhaps hydropower. And that's the type of discussion that moving forward one has to have with electricity in Guyana. But I want to just bring our guest Tom in this evening. You know, Tom has actually, whilst he was teaching at the University of Houston, he worked he lived in Nigeria, Angola, Papua New Guinea, the United Kingdom, Australia. He's actually worked all around Africa as an advisor and a trainer to government. So all around. So my question, of course, Tom, would ask you to bring an international perspective to this. You know, Guyana, like many other of the developing countries in Africa, was integrated into the global architecture around the same time. So with that, I'd want to ask you to start firstly, of course, by framing, do you see oil and gas as being the long-term future for an economy like Guyana, as well as what similarities and differences do you see with Guyana, of course, at a cursory level, with countries in Africa who have oil and gas or who may be resource rich? So thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Richard. Appreciate it. And thanks to the other guests for their insights. It's always very helpful to get that. It's easy to get constrained by your own limitations. But yeah, there's no doubt that Guyana, the resource for oil and gas, is one of the best in the world right now. The greatest potential of almost any place that I'm aware of. And so just from strictly the resource standpoint, it's just very bright indeed. But then, you know, if you get into what do you expect in terms of the impact on the country, you have to ask the question of the citizens, of the government, what really do you want oil to bring to you? And is it primarily just revenue into the central government? Is it employment? Is it diversification of the economy? Or do you want to see more sort of fairness, better infrastructure? So those are all questions that have to be asked, you know, and sometimes, governments usually have some idea what they want on that. If you look at just the revenues, certainly there's a lot of potential, but keep in mind, and I've actually modeled the production sharing agreement there, it's stable, that for the first maybe 7 to 10 years, depending on prices and capital costs, that the Guyanese government will only get 14.5% of those revenues. The rest will go to the companies for cost recovery and their profit oil. So, you know, there'll be limits as to what the government will get. Granted, it'll be of a very large pie, but they'll have only about 14 to 15%. So, you know, some of that it may take 7 to 10 years, depending on oil prices, before that starts going up. And, you know, there's enough uncertainty right now, let alone 10 years from now, about what prices will be, what sort of climate change agreements, what they will impose. So there's a risk there that, you know, that the real revenues are kind of back-end loaded, as I would call it, to the government. And so at that point, it may not be quite as lucrative, you know, once they get to getting a higher share. The other thing to keep in mind is, if you're looking at employment, is that oil and gas is an extremely capital-intensive but not very labor-intensive type of industry, at least the upstream oil industry. And so as a result, and it's becoming even more so. If you look at how technology has changed over the years, if you look at a platform, those ones that Kevin mentioned in Trinidad and Tobago a few years ago, you see a lot fewer people on those than you do now because of automation. So in terms of employment in the industry itself, it can be fairly limited. And what is there tends to be in these so-called oil field service contractors. They make up roughly 65 to 70% of the employment from studies I've done. So there can be some limits on that, you know. So then the question becomes, well, what is the impact on the rest of the economy? And a lot of economies that haven't had sort of good oversight have suffered sometimes from something called the Dutch disease. And they first observed that in Holland with their natural gas production there, where somehow, because of introduction of oil and gas, the rest of the economy declined. It atrophied because investments moved into oil and gas. It had an impact on their exchange rate, which made some of their exports less competitive. People moved, you know, away from rural pursuits like agriculture and fishing and moved to the capitals or the oil base to try to seek employment there. So, you know, one always has to be careful because I worked in Angola, you mentioned, prior to oil there. Angola is one of the world's largest exporters of coffee, sugar, tobacco, timber. Now, after oil, they don't have any of those. Those industries don't exist anymore. Nigeria used to be one of the world's largest exporters of rice. Now they're one of the world's largest importers of rice. And that's because of the impact of oil and gas. Not saying that they didn't necessarily manage that well, but that is something that happens if it's not managed well. And so potentially, just because of exchange rates, Guyana could see some of its industries atrophy. Maybe not things like bauxite or gold, but some agricultural industries, perhaps the fisheries, because people move away from those industries. And of course, anytime you make your economy less diverse, that can be sort of an issue. And plus, most of the employment tends to be during the construction phase. That's when they're building things. That's when there's a lot of activity. Once oil and gas gets on stream, it does not have a huge amount of employment. So there's concerns here that any economy that moves rapidly to a new base, especially resource commodity base, that can have a negative effect on the rest of their economy. It'll certainly generate a lot of revenues going to the central government, but then the question becomes, what does the central government do about that? How do they manage those revenues? And of course, that's the billion-dollar question, I guess you'd call it. How do they deal with that? You know, do they save? Do they diversify the economy? Do they, just how is that managed? So anyhow, that's, I guess, my contribution from trying to look at. I don't know the government there. I don't know how they do it, what plans they have, but certainly these are the types of issues that we've seen in many, many other countries. You get this Dutch disease leads to a boom or bust cycle as oil and gas goes up or down, oil and gas prices. You see employment drop. When that happens, you see the government revenues drop. You see potential for defaults on loans. So there can be some negative things that do come without a good system for managing this.
Right. Thanks for that. But, Tom, the world is moving in the direction of clean energy and sustainable energy. Many persons, of course, expect 2050 in terms of development of economies and development of energy and the energy sector to look much different than it does today. What do you see as being the future of this? Should Guyana embark on, full-fledged development of this sector? What advice would you give to our government, of course, at this point in time? What would you say in this regard? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, yes, thanks. Well, Kevin mentioned natural gas, which is, obviously a different type of fuel. It's certainly cleaner than many others, but not at the same level as, say, solar or wind power, wind generation. Those are still, probably still something they're growing. They'll become more important, but it may take quite some time before they can dominate. Even with natural gas, I always will point out Nigeria has one of the world's largest reserves of natural gas, but they have probably the worst supply of electricity. I can tell you that from having lived there for 6 years. So just translating that natural gas into power generation that's reliable to the consumer and to businesses can be a challenge. Once again, it has to be managed correctly. And we always hold out my poor friends in Nigeria as this example of what hasn't gone well, and so that doesn't mean it'll be the case in Guyana. Just even looking at the economy like Texas, I live in Houston, and every year I drive somewhere that's further west, like in West Texas, and it always strikes me that Texas is now, believe it or not, is the United States' largest producer of wind energy. If you go out to West Texas, you see these old pumping units pumping in these old wells, and right across the highway from them are these giant wind turbines generating wind energy. So, you know, even in places that are famous for oil like Texas, they are moving in the direction of wind energy. And it's something that even you're seeing that in places like Saudi Arabia, considering that. So it's the sort of thing that that should be considered. Putting all your eggs in one basket is always something we learned as kids is not always the best thing. And so to the extent Guyana can diversify its energy supply and its economy, that can always be a good thing.
Of course, Tom, the implication of this is that we ought to ensure that we ramp up our production and capitalize on the existing energy construct or the existing structure of energy globally at this point in time, or should we think about this, you know, in a longer term?
That's right. I mean, I think we don't know what window there will be for having the world still relying on oil. I mean, it'll certainly be there for some time to come, but is it 20 years, 30 years, 15 years? Hard to say before it starts declining, before climate agreements start having restrictions. And so that's right. While you have that resource, it's best to take advantage of it while you can. Like I said, the issue becomes the way the production sharing agreement is structured. The government's share of that is relatively small for a fairly long period of time. So then getting to that period where the government's percentage starts going up will be critical, you know, and hopefully that happens well before we start seeing oil begin to decline as a fuel in the world.
Absolutely. So I'll just pivot the discussion a bit, and I'll head back around, work back my way through over to Timothy, but I'll go to Kevin first, and I'll ask Kevin, you know, Tom has introduced the concept of Dutch disease and the resource curse, etc. Of course, something which we have heard quite a lot about here in Guyana, and I'm very certain, you know, you guys have heard a tremendous amount of it and have actually even lived through some of it in Trinidad. Kevin, but what within the current trajectory where Guyana is, what are some of the businesses that you expect to boom? And what are some of the businesses that you expect or you would anticipate to decline?
Well, before I explain that, I just want to use a cricket analogy, because West Indians understand things a lot better if we use a cricket analogy. So Richard, a mutual friend of ours, Dr. Roger Hussein, has done a statistical analysis of the performance of the West Indies team in the era of Brian Lara. And what he demonstrated is that when Lara made runs, the West Indies team either drew the test match or won the test match. When Lara didn't make runs, the West Indies team would have a high probability of losing the test match. So he uses that, Tom and Timothy, to explain Dutch disease, where you have one industry that has become so dominant in your cricket team that if that industry does well, everything is up and great. And if that industry doesn't do well or fails, then the country goes into a depression. And that is Roger's very simple way of putting across Dutch disease. Of course, it's more complicated than that. But yes, Trinidad has been through a boom in the 80s, a bust a boom in the 70s, a bust in the 80s. The 90s was sort of like a flat period, and then a boom in the first 15, I would say the first 14 years of the 21st century was a period of rapid economic expansion. And now we have, Trinidad's economy has contracted by about probably 17% in the last 5 years as a result of different factors, one of them being COVID, but there were things happening before that, before COVID. So these hydrocarbon-based economies tend to be very bipolar, right? And what you want to do, Guyana already has, in my opinion, one of the most diversified economies in the Caribbean. Before you had oil, you had several different horses pulling the cart, right? That's another analogy I use, right? So you had mining, agriculture, fisheries. You had a couple industries that were dominant. Now oil is going to come, and of course, within the next 2 to 3 years, oil's, I don't know if anybody has done a projection, but the contribution of oil to GDP may end up being like what Trinidad is. Trinidad energy contributes about 40 to 45% of GDP. And then there's the indirect contribution to GDP. For example, the oil industry in Guyana will lead to a demand for hotel rooms. So you will have more hotels being built. And that is going to be measured by the statisticians under services, but it's really related to the oil industry. So you asked about where the opportunities for Guyanese and the Guyanese private sector. And in the oil and gas industry, there's a spectrum of activity that starts off with exploration and ends with abandonment. So exploration, you consider that exploration to be, the birth, and abandonment to be the death. And that cycle could be anywhere 40, sometimes 50 years for an oil field. So within that, Guyanese entrepreneurs have already been participating in the shore-based activity that we see. Another opportunity is fabrication. And fabrication is something that could be done pretty quickly in Guyana. It will require a degree of training of the existing welders in Guyana to industrial level welding, but that ramp up in skills shouldn't take too long. So those are two things that I think could happen almost immediately. And then of course there are some indirect things like the hotels and so on, but the direct activities could be a shore-based activity and of course fabrication yards, right? In terms, I think Guyana has a guard against the Dutch disease. You asked about industries that could suffer as a result of the oil industry. What tends to happen is that as the oil industry begins to contribute money, and Richard is an economist, as it begins to contribute money to the treasury and the government begins to spend on services like construction services, the services sector expands. And the services sector starts to pull employment out of what we call the non-booming tradable sector, which would be your agricultural sector, your mining sector, and so on. So somebody working in the rice industry in Berbice might think that it might be better to go and work in Georgetown in a service type industry, in a restaurant or something like that. And that is the Dutch disease, I think. And one of the ways to guard against that is through your sovereign wealth fund, where you sterilize some of that money away and out of the country in U.S. treasuries and in securities and so on. And I think that the current government under Dr. Ali has signaled that they'll be revising the sovereign wealth fund law that was passed. Perhaps it was passed during the period when there was a motion of no confidence in the previous government. So that is an important piece of law that will go together with the Petroleum Commission bill. Those are important building blocks for Guyana going forward. So, but I want to make one more point before we go to Tim. One of the things that I'm on the local content committee, and one of the points I've been making is that when you think about skills, a lot of skills are transferable. So I'll give you, when the sugar industry closed down in Trinidad in 2003, there was a company that was working in the sugar industry that company was servicing the diesel engines of our sugar industry, Caroni 1975 Limited, which was your equivalent to Gaisuco. So when Caroni closed down in 2003, they had no business. And they went to the oil industry and they said, listen, we service diesel engines in the sugar industry, and you have diesel engines on these offshore platforms. Give us a chance. And they got a chance. And then from the state-owned oil company, they went to the multinationals. And the point is that there are mechanical engineering skills and electrical engineering skills. There are probably those skills resident in Guyana right now. And it simply requires a sort of facilitation of that migration of skill sets already in country to prepare them for the oil and gas industry. So you could have capacity in the country that simply needs to be shepherded towards the oil and gas sector.
Thank you, of course, for that, Kevin. I think before we wrap up this evening, what we can do is revisit perhaps some of the areas. I mean, I've combed through quite a bit of the literature on this, as you would have mentioned, being an economist. We can perhaps identify what are some of those areas in particular, because, we speak about many of these issues, but what does it mean for the layman in Guyana? What opportunity does it mean for the average person who would like to become involved? I have a couple of questions which I want to posit to Timothy, but of course the man behind the scenes has indicated to me that it is time for our first commercial break. So gentlemen, thank you for a very good first session. Viewers and listeners, we of course look forward to you being with us here for the second session. So Devin, you can take it away to the first commercial break.
TravelSpan is now booking repatriation flights and offering shop and ship. Book your repatriation flights to Guyana with TravelSpan. There are 2 flights weekly from JFK and 2 flights from Miami. All flights are non-stop to Guyana. TravelSpan will assist you with completing the forms and submitting to Guyana's government for your approval to travel. So book your flights today to Guyana, or if you choose not to travel, then call TravelSpan for their shop and ship program. TravelSpan is now offering shop and ship. Purchase a gift for yourself or a loved one. Send it to TravelSpan to arrange for all your shipping and clearing. Christmas is coming, so don't wait. Either book your flight or shop and ship with TravelSpan. In the US, call 718-845-0437. In Guyana, call 227-1701. And in Berbice, call 337-4287. And in Canada, call 647-557-6200. In US, 718-845-0437. In Guyana, call 227-1701. In Berbice, call 337-4287. And in Canada, call 647-557-6200. TravelSpan, serving you for over 26 years. Logistics International, based in Trinidad, with representatives in Guyana, is pleased to announce its shipping services from Trinidad to Guyana. Logistics provides shipping services and has experienced personnel to handle all of your shipping needs from Trinidad to Guyana. Buy in Trinidad and let Logistics handle all of your shipping to Guyana, from small boxes to container sizes. Call Logistics in Trinidad at 1-868-336-8218 to handle all of your shipping needs, and they handle all sizes. Logistics International has been shipping for over 22 years to many Caribbean countries with reliability and dependability. Call 1-868-336-8218 in Trinidad. That's 1-868-336-8218. Or email at liclcargo@gmail.com.
Ladies and gentlemen, viewers and listeners, welcome back to our program here tonight, Opportunities for Guyanese in the Oil and Gas Sector. I'll just give you a little bit of insight as to what happens. Anytime I host a program and we go off on a break, Timothy Jonas runs off into some corner that I am not sure, and then he comes back on just about when we count down about 5 seconds. So I'm not sure where he goes, but the very first question here tonight in this second segment will be posited to him. Timothy, you know, I am currently writing a thesis and which I intend to make into a book on, in particular, macroeconomic and institutional conditions necessary for sustainable growth in resource-rich developing countries. It's particularly looking at the case of Guyana. And in examining institutions, one of the very interesting statements that I came across in the literature, and it continued to recur. Apparently, there's an entire school of thought regarding this in institutional economics, as we discuss, and you'll find it to be very, very familiar. It speaks about the intensification of internal political struggle as resource-rich developing economies, or countries who have a lot of resources, natural resources, begin to develop it. Now, Kevin alluded earlier to the Petroleum Commission, and he also alluded earlier to the Sovereign Wealth Fund. For the Petroleum Commission, he said that one of the reasons why it was basically rejected was the fact that it gave quite a bit of power to the minister. I can say that in a thorough review of the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Guyana, the Natural Resources Fund, you'll find that the minister recurs in excess of about 3 dozen times throughout that document. It is replete in that now legislation. Timothy, what are some of the issues that you can identify in our legislative architecture which we ought to address to be able to reduce the instances of intensification of political struggle in Guyana? Just only to say that we may have begun to just see the beginning of it in 2020 with our almost 6 month long election. You're on mute, Tim.
I make my best speeches on mute. That question goes to the root of why I have gotten involved in public life. I don't believe that in Guyana, the fact that we have a lot of money on the horizon is a cause of intensification of our political rivalry. Our political rivalry has been severe, extreme, back against the wall, tooth and nail, when we were fighting for pennies after the economy was destroyed in the late 70s. Nothing has changed. The fact that the stakes are higher, I don't think has meant that the fight is more intense. The fight is based on other grounds that we all know of. Now, I heard Kevin talk about the criticism he had of the draft bill, and I smiled to myself when you said it was rejected. You see, the bill wasn't rejected, the bill was criticized. Very good, fair criticisms were raised, because the bill did what most legislation in Guyana does, which is to centralize the decision-making power in the responsible minister. Every time we do that, we run into problems, and we keep doing that in every area of endeavor. Now, we have some really great opportunities. As Kevin pointed out, our economy is wonderfully broad-based. There's the agriculture, rice, sugar, fish, shrimp, other agricultural produce. There is the mining, there is the timber, there is the bauxite potential, and now there's the oil. So there are many areas of endeavor. Now, the other aspect, which is good, is that our population is small, so that those industries aren't geared for a local market. If you want to make $1 in Guyana, you got to export. You got to find a larger market, so that the vagaries of disproportionate wealth that is possible as a result of oil and gas may be avoided that way. I don't know. I am in a room with two economists who know 10 times as much as me, and I'm putting this out more as a question than as a statement. The great danger is what you are talking about, and I want to give some examples of what we've seen. We know that the Minister of Natural Resources before 2015 was criticized for disposing of oil blocks in circumstances that were opaque. And in fact, when the then president was questioned about it, he was unable to answer and avoided the question. So the public found out about it after the fact. It was done secretly, and we discovered oil blocks had been given out to companies we never heard of. That was done because the statutory regime vests the discretion and the decision-making power to award contracts in the minister. We also knew that after the change of government in 2015, the country learned about this signing bonus for peanuts and learned that another contract had been signed away in circumstances where our own government said to its people that they're not going to tell us whether a contract was signed or not. And it wasn't until information was leaked that Trotman eventually conceded, yes, a contract had been signed and these were the terms, and then started making his nonsensical excuses about not having read it when he was criticized for the terms of the contract. That also was made possible because of the centralization of power as a result of the statutory model, which Kevin is criticizing. Now, Kevin has raised that there are hopefully changes that will be made to create tiers so that all the decision making isn't localized in the minister's office, so that he can make his decisions and no one knows about it. I have reservations about the bureaucratization of the whole issue. You see, what we are prone to do in Guyana as an administration, when we are confronted with the criticism that, man, you're keeping these decisions secret and you're keeping all the decision-making power for yourself, and this is breeding ground for corruption. What we do is we make the thing bureaucratic. So we call in this labor union representative and that bar association representative and all of that. And it creates the appearance of many people in the room, a lot of noise, but the real power has not been divested. And what we also do is we allocate to institutions which we already control. A lot of these institutions are peopled by individuals who are appointed by the same ministers. So you don't help yourself if you say, well, this GGMC can appoint a person to sit on the committee, to sit on the commission, if the GGMC itself is appointed by the minister. You haven't changed the rules there. All you've done is obscured what was previously obvious is no longer obvious, but is the same end result: centralized control. In Guyana, and this is the challenge that I want to say to any Guyanese, and this is what I want to throw out for people to think about. The system has to be one that satisfies you, even if the government is not the government of your choice. So if the people in charge are the people you don't like, the system must be one that you still feel satisfied that decisions are made transparently. And that has never been the case, but it is much too easy for Guyanese who are satisfied with that it's their government in charge and the government that they don't want is out of the door, to close their eyes, to turn a blind eye to what is going on under their noses. And we have to stop that. The only way in Guyana for there to be true transparency is if those people that you hate at the other end of the rainbow, at the other end of the spectrum, are sitting down there watching you make the decisions. That is the only way. And that happens if you're on that side or if you're on this side. If you like those people and you hate these people, or if you like these people and you hate those people. Once somebody from the other side is present and seeing what's happened and is involved as of right, not as of courtesy or as of grace, as of right, is involved there, then when something happens that should not happen, they can go kicking and screaming to the public. That is the only way that in Guyana, where we have two sides, we don't have many interest groups, we have two. Unless both of them are there, there is scope there is a breeding ground for corrupt transactions. Both of them need to be there. And that is what I've been repeating over and over, as you know. And when you talk about amending the Petroleum Commission Act, the bill, when you talk about fixing it, and you talk about decentralizing power and decentralizing discretion out of the hands of the minister exclusively, you gotta put the shadow minister in there. You gotta give the leader of the opposition the right to appoint people to that commission so that they're sitting in that room when the deal is being signed. And the thing is that it will work well for everyone. Because when that deal is signed, and to use our own ridiculously embarrassing example, where a ridiculous signing bonus is earned and nobody knows about it, then those people in opposition and those supporters of the opposition will say to their own leaders, you were in the room, how could you possibly let this happen? It removes the finger pointing, which leads to the polarization and the extreme views in our country.
So Timothy, I'll play almost devil's advocate, if you will, in this regard. I'll ask you this. There are changes which occurred in our constitution in 2001, and they have been alluded to on programs which you have appeared on previously when you've made the same point. How come, therefore, our Public Accounts Committee or some of the other select committees in Parliament or some of the commissions and even maybe even the own GCOM process of appointing the chairperson, how come we still see these instances and this difficulty occurring? And how can that help, that proposition which you are making help in this regard? After that, I'll move to Kevin and I'll move to Tom, because I want some other regional and international examples in this same regard. Of course, I'll just, viewers and listeners, you may see the topic tonight as being opportunities for Guyanese in the oil and gas sector, but these matters are very important for us to discuss because they really set up the landscape within which every player can occur. So, Timothy?
To answer your question, Richard, I think that we have to separate in our minds the system from the individuals in the system, working the system. If the system is transparent, it makes life more difficult for the individuals who may wish to undermine it. To use the example you gave, which is GCOM, I'm not going to go back to the amendments that were made in the 2001 Constitution, and I'll tell you why later. But to use the example you gave with GCOM, GCOM had a transparent system where what was going on was recorded by people's phones, and what was going on happened in front of all of the parties who were present in that room. So when a corrupt individual did what he did, it was immediately visible for all and sundry to see, and a hue and cry immediately went up. If that individual had been allowed to count his votes all by himself in a room, like our minister is allowed to use his discretion all by himself in a room, given the existing statutory structure, the system would have allowed him to get away with it without a murmur. It's the very fact of the transparency, the very fact that his enemies were there in that room with him watching him count, that led to the publicity of the whole thing and made his life so difficult, so that ultimately he failed. We can't guarantee that we have angels sitting in our administration, sitting in cabinet, sitting in government. Our history of 50 years has shown us that more likely than not, the people sitting in charge are not angels. So we need a system that protects us against these people who clearly have feet of clay. And it is the transparency in the system that stopped Mr. Mingo doing what he was doing. It wasn't because Mr. Mingo was an angel. We can't ensure that Mr. Mingo will be an angel. We have to make sure that the people who oppose Mr. Mingo, as well as his friends, are in that room when he's deciding what to do. And then when he makes a decision that is wrong, that goes contrary to the law, that hurts our interests, we can shout and cry, and we make it public immediately. That is why I'm saying that in any commission that's created, however you want to tier it, whatever bureaucracy you want to create, it mustn't obscure what must be a simple component that both sides, both enemies, got to be there, so that when you make a corrupt decision or when I make a corrupt decision, the other side can kick and scream. Otherwise, you will have Mr. Mingo in the room all by himself and nobody's the wiser. You will have a minister in the room signing a document, nobody the wiser. So you can pretty it up, you can color it up, but that's the bottom line. Do you want to have an individual subject to government control in a room by himself with all the decision-making power? Or do you want to expose it to the light and have both sides, scrutineers, sitting, being part of it, watching what's going on? It's the system we're talking about. Now, you mentioned the 2001 amendments to the Constitution. What I'll put to you is that part of our system, the duopoly, the control by the two parties, means that if those same two parties go to negotiate amendments, they're not negotiating for your benefit, my friend. They are negotiating to perpetuate their own control of the system and to see how to strategically place it so that they can continue that control. And a lot of what happened in 2001 is exactly that. I can give you examples, but that politicizes what for me is too important a conversation now. Maybe we can do that on another occasion.
Thank you. I'll come back to you because, you know, part of this decision-making process, etc., we also have to consider the speed at which decisions are made in light of what we would have said earlier. And what we are describing as this situation also creates a condition for gridlock. How do we move forward with something of this nature?
That's a very important point. Let me respond to that quickly. We know the delays we had with Payara. As soon as the new government took over, they scrapped it. Well, they didn't scrap it. They put it on hold because they needed to put their eyes on it. And that caused a delay. And you're talking about speed and haste. And I am agreeing with you. We need not just speed and haste, yes, but we need consistency and we need consistent forward movement. If the PPP government between 2015 and 2020, when they were in opposition, had eyes on the document, if they were in that commission, sitting in the decision-making room while Payara was being negotiated, if they were part of the process, then when they took over government in 2020, they would not even be a blip because they can continue seamlessly a process that they are already well informed in. Isn't it true that the delays occur and the entire freezing of the structure and reconsideration and the uncertainty that the foreign investor has, the all-important foreign investor has, his lack of trust in us because we are threatening to scrap a deal, occurs only because it was within the sole province of the minister to the exclusion of the opposition. So that when that opposition took over, they didn't have a clue and they were threatening to scrap it until they were satisfied. Wouldn't the system that allows both parties to be in the room avoid that entirely so that it could happen continuously, seamlessly, and there could be more consistency and reliability in our decision-making process moving forward? What happens in another 5 years, Richard?
Thanks, Timothy. Tom, you've heard this discussion. What is your input in this regard, especially with your knowledge of the African political economy and operating from both a government as well as a private sector in there?
Yes, well, as you said, I don't really have the ability to comment on Guyana's situation, but I have seen in my roles in those places, I either work for governments or spend a lot of time with government offices. And, you know, I think there's been several studies that shown that major resources can, the monies go not to individuals, I mean, but they go to the central government typically, because it's that government that owns the mineral rights. And to the extent that happens, that centralized, that strengthens the centralized power, because it's the individuals in that government have the authority to make those decisions. quite a few decisions. So so that does happen, and it can. And as Timothy said, if the opposition or a different part of the country or different ethnic groups don't feel like they're involved in that or aren't getting a fair share of that, that can lead to civil conflict. 3 of the countries that I worked in had civil wars. 2 of them while I was there, Angola and Papua New Guinea. And then when I worked in Nigeria, my first time there, it was not too long after their civil war. And it's no coincidence because they had oil and gas, and in the case of Papua New Guinea, a lot of their civil war was over the rights to copper. And so it can lead to more intense conflicts because you have more money involved, increase of the power of the central government. And so without that transparency, without that involvement of all sides, it can certainly lead to conflict. And even just as an example of that power, when I was doing some work for the Angolan government, they were trying to establish a sovereign wealth fund, which we all think is a good idea. And one of the advices I gave to them was, no matter what you do, don't make this political. Don't have all the decisions be made by a politically connected person, because you need to have this managed by someone who is an investment professional. So they, as with some of the things, they ignored my advice, and they actually appointed the son of the president of the country to manage that fund, which did not lead to a good result. So it is important to have those rules. It is important to recognize with great wealth comes great power, and having the government in place that will try to mitigate that, and systems in place is quite important.
Thank you, Kev, for that insight. Of course, we'll go through these matters in detail as we further on the conversation here this evening. But I just want Kevin to drop his input into this, because Kevin has sat in the corridors of power in a country who is both similar and dissimilar to Guyana in a variety of ways. So Kevin, what are some of the things which you are seeing in Guyana? If you were to just give straight advice to say, change this, what would be the number one in this regard, considering the political economy aspect which we're discussing here in this segment?
Well, I mean, this is not really political economy. This is more to do with, I would think, reserve, what I call reserves management, right? We are told that there are 8 billion barrels of oil equivalent discovered thus far. Who has told us that? Exxon. And I think Exxon, I'm sure Exxon is a good company, and they would give accurate numbers and so on. But what if you have another company coming and say, we have found 1 billion barrels of oil equivalent, do we take their word for it? And then another company comes and says, we found 300 million barrels of oil. Do we take their word for it? So I don't know if you understand, if you get the point I'm trying to make here. So in Trinidad, we have an annual audit of our natural gas reserves. It's a company called Ryder Scott from Dallas comes in and does that every year. And every 3 years, there's an audit of the oil reserves. And these are independent companies that come in and work for the government of Trinidad and Tobago. And the companies open up all their files to these auditors, and they are, of course, highly respected companies. They do this all over the world. So I think it's important for Guyana to get a third-party verification of these numbers. The other point is that the 8 billion barrels of oil is recoverable resources. Now, that's a term which has been bandied about a lot, but recoverable resources is really an umbrella term that includes 5 different categories of reserves and resources. So within there is proven reserves, there is probable reserves, and possible reserves. And then there's what you call contingent resources and prospective resources. So what's the point? The point is that if you look at Exxon's annual report submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission, that report, the Securities and Exchange Commission of the United States, you could only report to them proven reserve numbers. You can't report to them recoverable reserve numbers. So the point is that Guyana needs to have a couple of things, and this will fall out, in my opinion, from the Petroleum Commission. One, there has to be an independent, assessment of this very large resource and growing resource. And two, I think there should be some level of granularity around the reserves now, because those 5 categories of reserves/resources all mean different things. So for purposes of planning, if I were in putting on my Trinidad hat, I would want to know what is the proven reserve of oil, the proven reserve of gas, because those things have, the proven reserves have more certainty around them, more commercial certainty, and that's why it is what the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US requests when you're reporting to them. So that's something which I think will fall out eventually from the work of the Petroleum Commission.
Thanks, Kevin. Viewers and listeners, thank you. Of course, this segment, we have gone through some of the discussions around the political structure, the legislative structure, and what we can expect moving forward, how to prevent some of the, or at least discussing from a very cursory way how we can perhaps look at these matters. The third segment, of course, will come after the break. Behind the scenes, we'll see Timothy disappearing once again. So we'll be back in about, I reckon to say, 2 minutes. Certainly look forward to this final segment, which we have coming up.
Logistics International, based in Trinidad, with representatives in Guyana, is pleased to announce its shipping services from Trinidad to Guyana. Logistics provides shipping services and has experienced personnel to handle all of your shipping needs from Trinidad to Guyana. Buy in Trinidad and let Logistics handle all of your shipping to Guyana, from small boxes to container sizes. Call Logistics in Trinidad at 1-868-336-8218 to handle all of your shipping needs, and they handle all sizes. Logistics International has been shipping for over 22 years to many Caribbean countries with reliability and dependability. Call 1-868-336-8218 in Trinidad. That's 1-868-336-8218. Or email at liclcargo@gmail.com. TravelSpan is now booking repatriation flights and offering shop and ship. Book your repatriation flights to Guyana with TravelSpan. There are 2 flights weekly from JFK and 2 flights from Miami. All flights are non-stop to Guyana. TravelSpan will assist you with completing the forms and submitting to Guyana's government for your approval to travel. So book your flights today to Guyana, or if you choose not to travel, then call TravelSpan for their Shop and Ship program. TravelSpan is now offering Shop and Ship. Purchase a gift for yourself or a loved one. Send it to TravelSpan to arrange for all your shipping and clearing. Christmas is coming, so don't wait. Either book your flight or shop and ship with TravelSpan. In the US, call 718-845-0437. In Guyana, call 227-1701. And in Berbice, call 337-4287. And in Canada, call 647-557-6200. In US, 718-845-0437. In Guyana, call 227-1701. In Berbice, call 337-4287. And in Canada, call 647-557-6200. TravelSpan, serving you for over 26 years.
Viewers and listeners, welcome back. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our program here this evening. So we went through some of the harder questions during the last segment. Of course, this segment we'll try to bring it back directly on stream. But before, of course, we head into directly discussing the opportunities which we see existing, which may present itself. I want to ask that we move from Tom back down through to Kevin over to Timothy to discuss a matter which, of course, has been at the forefront of the Guyanese discussion as it relates to oil and gas. And Tom, how important is local content policy, and local content legislation for Guyanese to benefit from the oil and gas sector?
In terms of employment, and it is certainly important. Actually, the oil companies, the likes of ExxonMobil, Hess, et cetera, is not where the main employment is. If I did some studies looking at the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics a few years ago, and in the oil and gas sector, something like 70% of the jobs are in the so-called oil service companies and oil construction companies, the ones that the big companies like ExxonMobil will hire and contract with to do the work. So that's where a lot of the sector's employment is. And the challenge that will be faced, I think, with, and so that's employment, and the businesses too, in terms of contracts, et cetera, are also with those same companies, you know, in the oil service support sector. And the challenge that Guyana will face is, for one, this is deep water, far offshore. Two, these are FPSOs, which means I know Kevin had referred to some of the construction done in Trinidad, you know, during the various phases of the industry's development in there. But this is different because these are assembled, these are take tankers, they're modified in Korea or China or somewhere like that, and they're just floated there. And there's no construction work for Guyanese when there are FPSOs. And so it's from the standpoint strictly of local content, this FPSO type of vessel is not one that lends itself to that. And so, because like I said, a lot of the jobs are during the construction phase, and so that will limit fairly substantially how much employment opportunities there are. To get the local content going, I've seen some examples in Angola that were good ones that the government initiated. It has to be a sort of a partnership between the government and the companies, and even some cases third parties to get this going. There was one example in Angola. There's a center for entrepreneurial assistance, I guess is how it would translate. And it was the main companies there, Sonangol, the national oil company, and the government formed this organization that would go out and help local businesses to get the business. What they did, they trained them on expectations of companies, on things like health, safety, contracting, et cetera. They mentored them. They even set up a database where these companies could register to be pre-qualified, that the companies would then commit to using these same databases would then is where the invitations to tender would go out. So those companies could overcome some of the communication issues, could overcome some of the skill gap issues they may have had, and in that way, it would overcome some of those obstacles. In addition, when I worked in Angola for a company, we actually set up a loan program because some of these companies need loans in order to import equipment, that kind of thing, to purchase supplies to get started. Because they may operate on a small level, like that diesel repair company that Kevin mentioned, and that's a perfect example of how they can do that. Another case, there was a water pump company in Angola that one company partnered them up with an oil pump company, so they would learn that business and gain that expertise and be able to get contracts. So this whole business, I mean, it certainly a good government policy is important, no doubt about that, but it does require a cooperation between government and industry in order to make it work. But even with that, we have to have the expectation that that industry, that local content, is still subject to boom or bust. I looked at some data also in the U.S. apologies that only using U.S. data, but it was easier to obtain that information. In 2000 and what year is that? 14 to 2016, the employment in that industry for the oil service sector declined by 40% in just a 2-year period. 40%. And that's how sensitive it is to the price of oil. And so that's the kind of things you have to keep in mind, that with local content supporting oil and gas sector, it is important. It requires that cooperation, that innovative thinking, but it also is very much subject to all the boom and bust cycle as well. So keeping that in mind.
Thanks very much for that, Tom. You know, in Guyana, we actually have ExxonMobil has collaborated with DAI, the international global consultancy firm, to form something which is called Center for Local Business Development. However, I am of the view that whilst the center works well, it does its purpose, we also need government to aid in a private sector development format, where a gap analysis is conducted as to what the specific needs are of the private sector, and in particular those areas where we can improve, for example, internal efficiency measures which can improve productivity of firms and by extension total factor productivity in the country. So I think that, you know, a private sector development program is certainly something that's needed, and my view is that it goes hand in hand with a local content legislation. But what type of local content legislation is important? And I'll ask Kevin to lend some insight here as to what he personally believes is the ideal type of local content for Guyana. Kevin, you know, there are a variety of models, of course, you are well familiar with them, but what do you believe Guyana needs at this time and at this stage in our development?
You know, I know it's getting late, so I'll quickly say that local content flows out of capacity. So the local capacity must be developed if you are to have the local content as a product of the capacity building. So I would say that emphasis on skills development right now is critical. And you know, I think it is a feature maybe of post-colonial societies that were ruled by the British. But when we think about skills development, we think about PhDs and master's degrees and all these degrees, right? But that is not necessarily the only thing which is required. There's a lot of technical and vocational training that would be required to work in this industry. And I also made the point that there are industries, and there's one I forgot and I want to mention it. While, you know, there are industries that could be migrated from the current state into working in the oil and gas sector. And I'll give you an example, and I think it's relevant to Guyana. There is a company called the Wood Group, which is a big oil and gas service group out of Scotland. And they have a big presence in Trinidad, and they do all the maintenance work for BP offshore. And they started off as they were a fishing company in the North Sea. They used to have fishing trawlers in the North Sea. And then one day oil was discovered in the North Sea. And they realized that here's an opportunity to go into the supply vessel business. And they started to supply the platforms and the rigs with whatever they needed and so on. So they're no longer in fishing, they're now in the oil and gas services and supply vessels and so on. So I think there is, as I'll reiterate again, the shore-based opportunity. And there is currently one or two shore bases in Guyana. There's probably need for more shore-based space in Guyana. Not probably, there is, because the industry is going to go through this 10-year steep growth period. There is an opportunity to train young Guyanese in the different types of industrial welding, like MIG welding and flux core welding and so on. And so those are two opportunities, Richard, that I think are immediate sort of low-hanging fruit that the Guyanese citizens could get involved in. with regard to local content, I think it's important. If you look at the amount of money Exxon spends to lift a barrel of oil out of the ground, let's say it is $25 US per barrel to lift a barrel of oil out of the ground. You begin to question what percentage of that $25 is spent in Guyana at this point in time, and it's probably very small. I haven't done a study to determine what it is. So what you really want to do is to increase that percentage over time, but that happens from building the capacity. And I'll end by saying that one of the aspects of capacity building is also infrastructure support, the physical infrastructure support. So the road network, the ports and so on, the electricity, all that creates this ecosystem that builds the capacity that we need. So skills and infrastructure. All right.
Right. Thank you. Of course, the folks, the goodly gentlemen and in the background are indicating to me that we have to wrap up the discussion. We have in no way even remotely exhausted where we should be. I'll perhaps have to request of the host that we keep a part 2 of this with this very same panel. So I'll wanna ask guys, if you can perhaps give your closing remarks, and just if you were to leave one piece of advice for the average Guyanese, the average person in Guyana, as to where the opportunity would lie, or what they ought to do, what would that be? Of course, I'll go over to Timothy. Sorry, given that he is the next person. Timothy.
Well, Richard, sorry. For the first time, I don't like your question. I don't think that we should be holding out false promises to Guyanese. If you listen to the conversation that's been had so far, Tom said it very clearly. Oil and gas is 100 miles offshore. It's deep water. It's a highly specialized, highly technical affair. The floating platforms are made abroad. We never see them. The closest they come to our shore is 100 miles away. The people who work there are highly specialized. The oil never reaches here. The gas doesn't reach here. It goes on the platforms and it is sent off. So the access that the Guyanese will have will be in the service providers and in the provision of those satellite companies, the service providers. If you want to give direct advice to a Guyanese who has spent his life at Gaisuko or planting rice or planting a kitchen garden, you're wasting time. You're holding out a false promise to him. I would more like to direct my comment to government policies. We have a small population. Unemployment is not going to be a large issue in Guyana if we spend this money correctly, promoting agriculture and promoting the infrastructure, the roads and the bridges that will help agriculture and will help timber and mining. If we promote hydroelectricity so that there's a manufacturing component that can be developed, and immediately as the service industries increase, restaurants, taxis, hotels, the construction industry, we are not going to have an employment problem. But what we do need to do, in my view, is we need to ensure that the playing field is not level. There needs to be favoritism to Guyanese. The foreigners will come and they bring their expertise and they are welcome. But I would have a differentiated income tax threshold. I would have visa requirements and costs for that. I would have limitations on foreign ownership of land so that the equity, the advantages are available. We talk about welding. You want to train Guyanese to weld. That's all well and good. But how do you do that? To my mind, the way to do that is if that employer who is servicing gas and oil needs a welder, and he knows that to import a welder, he'll have to pay for that person to come, for the person's spouse to come, for their children to come, or for them to come in 1 month and go out 1 month. He'll have to pay for them to be accommodated in a hotel or an apartment here, pay for them to go to school, acclimatize them here. Or alternatively, he can train a Guyanese to do it, and the Guyanese can benefit from a different income tax threshold so that the money means more to him. It is therefore in the interest of the employer to employ a Guyanese and to train a Guyanese. And if it's done that way, then we get rid of the bureaucracy that we are so accustomed to, which has its accompanying inefficiencies and corruption. And we treat oil and gas as a windfall. We don't put all our eggs in that basket. And the people who are in Guyana and are already trained as agriculturalists, as miners, they know how to deal with heavy machinery for mining and timber. They can expand on the areas of their knowledge rather than encouraging them to go so that all our eggs are in one basket and we fall prey to the Dutch disease. So I would direct my focus to government policies rather than to trying to say to a Guyanese farmer, this is the option you have. That's not going to work.
You would tell the average Guyanese, therefore, to hold their governments accountable and deliver on the promises that they make.
You sound like a convert, Richard.
Kevin, your final words.
Yeah, my final comment would be that oil is a sunset industry, but the sun is not going to set tomorrow, or the sun is not going to set in 5 years or 10 years, but perhaps the sun may set in 20 to 25 years on the oil industry. That doesn't mean that the world will reach a point where it will need zero oil, but demand for oil will begin to fall progressively in the future. So Guyana has, in my opinion, probably a 15 to 20 year window to take this oil wealth from Stabroek Block and the other blocks and so on, and use it to, one, I think, to preserve the existing economic structure you have here, this diversified economy, but to also create this future economy, this green economy, to shift to renewables, to shift power generation to natural gas and renewables, to build your infrastructure, to connect Brazil to Guyana and so on. So I think that has always been in the back of the mind of all the policymakers and the persons in parliament and so on, that we have a limited time now. It's not like Trinidad in 1908, right? When Trinidad discovered oil, you have 120-something year run. You're probably going to have, maybe 20 to 25 years max before you start to see the world need less and less oil. It could happen before, but on average, I think you have a 20-year window. So make the most of that 20-year window.
Thank you very much for that, Kevin. Tom?
I'll just briefly add, I don't think I have a whole lot more to add than what the Timothy and Kevin added. What Timothy said, I think, is really, you have to be realistic. Don't believe all the hype about things coming to the average person. The hype is what money will be coming to the government, no doubt, but you should be cautious. The opportunities will be limited in the oil and gas sector, and what you have to do is, like you said, Richard, hold the government accountable and hope that they will do what they can to diversify and strengthen the remainder of the economy. It's not oil related.
Thanks very much for that, Tom. We've heard many times that the oil and gas sector, it's what we call a capital intensive sector. It's a sector where you will not see a great number of people being employed. But what we do hope is that the indirect effects and proper policy and management of the economy will really lift the standard of living for all. With that being said, I just want to say that I've combed through quite a lot of material that has been written locally, and in the interest of doing some credence to the topic here at hand, from the sectoral side or from the private sector side, There are four main areas which I have been able to identify as being sectors which ought to be indirectly impacted by the oil and gas sector. These include sustainable tourism, which includes hotels, accommodations, restaurants, catering, and transportation for them, also attractions and sightseeing. Another sector is commerce and specialized business services, of course, looking at logistics and transportation once again, and business support services. Another has been sustainable food and agricultural sectors, with smart agriculture and value-added agriculture. And then other sectors which we're expecting, this is of course from the survey which I have done of all of the literature on Guyana: health, green technology, and even climate resilience as we begin to move into a new era. But that's from the private sector side. What skills do we expect to see increasing in demand? If we look at vocational labor, machine operators, mechanics, machinists, electricians, electrical technicians, welders, masons, plumbers, anything to do with building out the infrastructure of the country. So the construction skill set. In terms of technical professionals, you're looking at tax, accounting, auditing, HSSC, logistics, supply chain management, even chefs and engineers can be categorized there. And of course, managerial professionals, hotel management, food and beverage, and of course, admin and operations remain very important to the development of the country. So just in a nutshell, those are some of the areas, both from the private sector side, so from the opportunity side, and then from the employment side, or the average labor provision side, where we expect to see opportunities arising, of course, in many cases not directly from the oil and gas sector, but indirectly as a result of the development of the sector. I just want to wrap up tonight's discussion by thanking these three gentlemen who have so graciously given us almost 2 hours of their evenings. Timothy has revealed to us that where he runs off to is to put his kids to bed and give them the final good night kiss. So Kevin, Tom, I'm sure that you guys are perhaps not in a similar situation there, but thank you so much. We certainly appreciate, and we will keep you updated as to whether part 2 for this will continue, because I do think that we ought to expand further on this very interesting topic of oil and gas and Guyana's development. I want to wish all the viewers and listeners a very safe evening. Please continue to guard yourself against the coronavirus and ensure that you take all the necessary precautions. And I certainly look forward to hosting this program again in the near future. Thank you, gentlemen, and good evening, viewers and listeners.
Thank you very